The Tao of Heidegger by Tim Delaune. Introduction. Recent scholarship in the testimony of close associates has confirmed what has long been suspected. Martin Heidegger was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophies, including especially Taoism. Much of this work has focused on the connections between Heidegger's ontological and metaphysical thought. But if Taoism strongly influenced these aspects of Heidegger's philosophy, then it is reasonable to surmise that Taoism also held sway with respect to his political thought, and in particular his considerations of the role of technology, and whether and under what circumstances it is a bane or boon to human being. This paper explores the associations between Heidegger's work on politics and technology on the one hand, and Taoist thought on the other, focusing specifically on the influence of the Dao de Jing. It proceeds first to elucidate the evidence that Heidegger was significantly interested in and influenced by Taoism and the Dao de Jing. It then discusses briefly the connections that have been uncovered between Taoism and Heidegger's understanding of being, before proceeding to explore the influence of Taoism on his theories of politics and technology. It concludes with an examination of what light Taoism might shed on the enduring question of Heidegger's association with German National Socialism, and a brief consideration of how his Taoist-influenced thoughts on technology's role might bear on specific, contemporary, politico-technological concerns. Heidegger and the Tao. The Dao de Jing is a collection of 81 short verses providing general advice as to how one should live, and occasionally more specific advice as to how one should govern a polity. It is commonly attributed to the Taoist sage Lao Tzu, and indeed is sometimes referred to by the name of its putative author. Lao Tzu may well be a fictitious character, however. At the very least, his identity as an actual single person is doubtful. Some scholars believe that the Dao de Jing is attributed to Lao Tzu because it was customary in classical China for authors to sign their works with the name of the founder of the school to which they belonged. Others contend that the Dao de Jing originated from a community of like believers who apparently did not have a nominal founder, not even one named Lao Tzu, rather than a single author. On the whole, there are few formal difficulties in understanding the Dao de Jing. The problem is rather one of meaning. The text of the Dao de Jing is highly elusive, with many of the allusions' meanings now lost. In large part, this is because it was originally written in archaic Chinese, which has no active or passive, no singular or plural, no case, no person, no tense, no mood. Almost any word can be used as almost any part of speech, and there are no inviolable rules. All of this has provided ample room for interpretation and corruption in translation and copying over the centuries. Indeed, as of 1965, no other book than the Bible had been translated into English as often as the Dao de Jing. By current estimates, the Dao de Jing appears in over 200 versions in 17 languages. The inherent open-textured nature of the work, together with the uncertainty involved in translating it, has meant that we have to decide for ourselves what is meant, within more or less broad limits set by the text. To read the Dao de Jing is an act of creation. This is not to say, however, that the Dao de Jing is completely open-ended. As a text, it forecloses at least some meanings. Thus, Taoist scholar and translator Michael Lafargue insists that the Dao de Jing does not embody an ineffable absolute, but rather contains an aesthetic center with a surplus of meaning, which is what makes it and many other religious texts ineffable. The Tao does not refer in any precisely delimited way to any metaphysical reality or principle. Rather, the Dao de Jing actually speaks of all kinds of things at the same time. It detaches these things from their immediate context in order to create an essential and universal form of expression that will apply to all situations. The method by which the Dao de Jing accomplishes this is ingenious. Much of the text comes from maxims rooted in ancient Chinese oral tradition, but these aphorisms, many of which derive directly from popular wisdom, are in the Dao de Jing, skillfully transformed in such a way as to have them say the opposite of the truths they were originally meant to convey. In this way, the constant use of paradoxes is indeed primarily intended to detach us from any general idea or prejudice, leading Christopher Schipper, the first Westerner ever ordained as a Taoist priest, to speculate that, Generally speaking, the style of writing of the Dao de Jing sought to convey something about the conflict between our consciousness and that which is unknowable within ourselves. Heidegger's interest in this paradoxical and open-ended text developed in the context of a growing interest in Taoism in Germany that developed around and after the turn of the 20th century, in part as a result of a growing skepticism about the ideal of progress and alarm at the rapid growth of industrial capitalism. In Germany, this concern over the moral and spiritual vacuum of modern Western civilization was closely connected with the Völkisch movement, a cultural phenomenon that expressed restless nationalist sentiments and sought political and cultural assuagement through a return to an idealist age in the past, and that also stimulated interest in Asian thought. Heidegger's own interest in Taoism appeared publicly as early as 1930, when, in a discussion of intersubjectivity, after a lecture in Bremen on the essence of truth, he requested and read from a translation of the aphorisms of Zhuangzi, second only to Lao Tzu in the pantheon of Taoist sages, in order to make his point. Indeed, a certain Daoist flavor to Heidegger's thought is apparent at least as early as his seminal 1927 work, Being and Time. In his insistence on undoing the Cartesian subject-object distinction and returning to a way of thinking about being rooted in the pre-Socratics, Heidegger deployed phenomenological accounts that resonate with certain parables in the Zhuangzi. His account of physical objects as, depending upon context and the observational orientation of the humans who observe them, tools ready for use, ordinary and assumed parts of the environment that are barely noticed, or problems to be avoided or solved, resonates with Zhuangzi's anecdote of the gnarled and knotted shu tree that appears useless to carpenters, but can serve as a landmark and shade provider to travelers. In both Heidegger's and Zhuangzi's phenomenological readings, there is no objectively useful or useless matter, but rather an object's situation with respect to humanity is determined intersubjectively and culturally, not just for humanity in general, but for particular beings depending upon their own frames of reference. In a similar vein, Heidegger repeatedly refers in Being and Time to the activity Umgang, which Hubert Dreyfus prefers to translate as handling rather than coping, with emphasis on the Zen-like flow involved in skillfully using ready-to-hand tools. This kind of skillful, flowing handling of tools and engagement with objects in a manner that transcends Cartesian subject-object distinctions is nicely illustrated in Zhuangzi's description of how an expert butcher breaks down an ox. We do not yet know whether Heidegger had, at the writing of Being and Time, encountered or consulted the Zhuangzi, but he seems to be traveling along some of the same roads even this early in his work. It is also not known for certain when Heidegger first encountered the Dao de Jing. We do, however, know that he began but did not finish a translation of at least portions of the work into German. In the spring of 1946, Heidegger suggested to Paul Shiye Xiao, a Chinese scholar then in residence in Freiburg, that they collaborate on a translation of the Dao de Jing that summer. Xiao agreed gladly, being convinced that Lao Tzu's ideas would contribute to the reflections of the German people, and indeed of the Western world after the disastrous World War. Xiao, like many other Asians, had been surprised by the difficulty many of Heidegger's Western contemporaries had in understanding Heidegger's thinking. What he brought to language has frequently been said similarly in the thinking of the Far East. For example, temporality has always been understood differently in China than in the West. Everything is connected with everything else, and in each moment there is concealed the entire past and also the open future. Xiao thus viewed the proposed collaboration as a potentially fruitful one that could help clarify similarities between Heidegger's thought and Chinese philosophy. By the end of the summer of 1946, Xiao and Heidegger translated only 8 of 81 chapters of the Dao de Jing. Though they planned to continue the work the following summer, Xiao was, at that time, receiving invitations to lecture throughout Germany on Asian thought and wished to pursue those opportunities. Xiao also states in this regard to his decision, "I could not, during our work together, get free from a slight anxiety that Heidegger's notes might perhaps go beyond what is called for in a translation. As an interpreter and mediator, this tendency unsettled me. Heidegger had essentially inquired, and asked penetratingly, tirelessly, and mercilessly about every imaginable context of meaning in the mysterious interplay of the symbolic relations within the text. Only the complete constellation of meanings was sufficient for him to dare to determine the outline of a form of thought capable of rendering the multilayered meaning of the Chinese text into Western language in a clear and comprehensible way. Xiao thus pulled out of the project at least in part because he felt that Heidegger was being overly creative in the act of translating the Dao de Jing, though this creativity was informed by the central goal of finding all the meanings in this pluripotent Chinese text. Heidegger's manipulation of the text can be seen through an exchange of translations of one of the Dao de Jing's chapters between Heidegger and Xiao. At Heidegger's request, Xiao wrote out the 2 lines of chapter 15 in decorative calligraphy. They read, "Who can, settling the muddy, gradually make it clear? Who can, stirring the tranquil, gradually bring it to life?" Heidegger's rereading of these lines in a 1947 letter to Xiao is as follows: "Who can be still, and out of stillness, and through it, move something on to the way, so that it comes to shine forth? Who is able, through making still, to bring something into being?" In the vast range of translations of the Dao de Jing, this one, infused as it is with such Heideggerian pet concepts as shining forth and bringing into being, cannot be said to be out of the mainstream, though this probably says more about the width of the stream than about the fidelity of Heidegger's translation. Before their collaboration ended, Heidegger and Xiao translated chapters 1, 15, 18, 25, 32, 37, 40, and 41 of the Dao de Jing. These were not published and have not yet been found among Heidegger's papers. Because these translations are, at least for the moment, lost to us, and because they were consciously developed in avoidance of other translators' works, any attempt to find an existing translation that comes closest to Heidegger's understanding of the Dao de Jing is doomed. No existing translation will, with any certitude, match the translations Heidegger produced. This presents a problem for understanding the Dao de Jing's influences on Heidegger, as the multiplicity of translations and the multiplicity of meanings encoded therein necessitates some guesswork as to the content of the specific texts he encountered. In addition to those 8 chapters that Heidegger translated, scholars suspect that Heidegger was closely familiar with the contents of the Dao de Jing generally. Does Heidegger's attempt to translate Lao Tzu throw aside all standards of scholarship? In the attempt to translate Lao Tzu, Heidegger was led from a logos language to an ideographic language, which necessitated his working through image words, intensifying concentration on the individual word. Thus, Heidegger reads and translates the graphemes of a language the spoken words of which he does not understand. But must we not first understand what is really going on when Heidegger speaks and reads as he does? Heidegger demands a language in which it is not primarily a question of univocal concepts and their coherent connection, but rather of images whose meanings are multidimensional and inexhaustible. In this sense, Heidegger's attempts to translate the Dao de Jing closely mirror his unconventional translations of pre-Socratic Greek thinkers and of Sophocles. It is in this sense that Reinhard May describes Heidegger's paraphrasing or poetic rewriting of the chapter 15 excerpt as characteristic. Heidegger's use of the Dao de Jing is also characteristic of his method in its counter-analytical direction. Just as adherents to analytical philosophy have dismissed Heidegger, so too have they been dismissive of Asian philosophy, and at least one key source of their objections to both has been the prejudice that literary forms are not proper for modern philosophical writing, which should be conducted by way of formal treatises working through rational, logical argumentation, rather than by playing with poetic images. Indeed, Otto Pögeler puts Heraclitus and Lao Tzu on roughly the same footing in terms of influence on Heidegger, in the context of the necessity of play. Referring to the winter 1934-35 Hölderlin lecture, Pögeler asks, when Heidegger speaks of a play without why, ein Spiel ohne Warum, the connection with Nietzsche and Eckhart is clear. And yet, is he still speaking here of the true Heraclitus? It must be asked similarly whether Heidegger does not also adduce from Lao Tzu only what he himself is seeking. Note from the narrator, it's certainly the case that without why, ohne Warum, makes us think of Eckhart. However, another likely source is the poet Angelus Silesius, who, in his collection of poems called the Cherubic Wanderer, famously wrote, "The rose is without why, she blooms because she blooms. Die Rose ist ohne Warum, sie blüht, weil sie blüht." Of course, Silesius himself is influenced by Eckhart as well as Boehme, but yes, so certainly Eckhart is probably the source. His affinity with Zen and through Zen, Taoism has been noted elsewhere. All right, back to the text. Moreover, the form of Heraclitus's text is especially congruent with that of Lao Tzu's, both being woven from pregnant utterances couched in an archaic language rich in elusive power and interspersed with lacunae of obscurity. Heidegger scholars, including William Barrett, Stanley Rosen, Reinhard May, and Otto Pögeler, have pointed out since the 1960s connections between Heidegger's thought and core Daoist ideas, and Heidegger's later philosophy is rife with such Daoist concepts as the way, Tao, dwelling, abiding, remaining, and returning. Some examples among many that are available should suffice to underline this point. Heidegger's early work, especially Being and Time, completed before he is known to have had contact with Eastern philosophy, is seen as having a remarkably Taoist tone. The term Tao itself is translated into English most commonly as the way, a term that makes frequent appearance in Heidegger. The theme of the way is explicitly present in Being and Time, and runs throughout all of Heidegger's writings. In The Question Concerning Technology, Heidegger states, "Questioning builds a way. We would be advised, therefore, above all, to pay heed to the way. The way is one of thinking." Heidegger invoked Lao Tzu explicitly thus in On the Way to Language. Perhaps there lies concealed in the word way, Tao, the mystery of all mysteries of thoughtful saying, as long as we let this name return to its unspokenness and are able to accomplish this letting. All is way. Heidegger, in following Taoist leads, may simply have been using them to further his desire to place philosophy back into the stream of life rather than to perpetuate its role as a detached seeker of objective, foundational truth. There is strong evidence that Heidegger's attempt to overcome 2,000 years of Western metaphysics, according to Pögeler, by shifting from an analytical to a meditative mode of thinking, was motivated by and found a way of thinking through the problem in Asian sources, including Taoism. Notably, another English translation of the term Tao is logos. Knowing this, Heidegger may well have sought to upend the tradition of Western logos and its Aristotelian progeny, logic, by silently importing Eastern ideas, sometimes grounded in pre-Socratic sources. Heidegger's antipathy toward Western logic systems is well known, and was apparently connected to his understandings of Eastern thought. In a conversation with Heidegger and an unnamed industrialist friend at Totnauberg, Xiao answers the friend's question about apparent contradictions in the Dao de Jing. Why do the Chinese speak this way? With the response that it was because the Chinese did not know Aristotelian logic, to which Heidegger responded, "Thank God that they didn't." In the letter on humanism, Heidegger states, "We are so filled with logic that anything that disturbs the habitual somnolence of prevailing opinion is automatically registered as a despicable contradiction." Moreover, he argues, the Aristotelian Cartesian logic, as it has come down to us, is itself already grounded in a particular subject-object answer to the question about being's relationship to being, and so cannot properly be applied as a method for answering the question ab initio. Heidegger occasionally even counterposes Eastern thought to Western logic explicitly, as when he claims that we have still scarcely begun to think of the mysterious relations to the East that found expression in Hölderlin's poetry. Or, as he argues in the Introduction to Metaphysics, in the seemingly irrelevant division being and thinking, we have to recognize that fundamental orientation of the spirit of the West that is the real target of our attack. It can be overcome only originally, that is, in such a way that its inceptive truth is shown its own limits, and thereby founded anew. Still, Heidegger was largely and puzzlingly silent about the role of Eastern thought generally, and Taoism specifically, in his work. Despite the certainty of Heidegger's familiarity with at least parts of the Dao de Jing, and quite possibly more than passing familiarity with the whole, he asserted repeatedly in connection with ideas clearly explicated in that work that until himself they had never yet at all been able to appear as thinking. Gunther Wohlfahrt characterizes this assertion as thoughtless at the least and unlikely to be the result of carelessness. He also views the similarities between Heidegger's thought and Lao Tzu's as very unlikely to have been coincidental. Wohlfahrt refrains from speculating, however, why Heidegger failed to cite his Eastern source here. Similarly, while in the same conversation criticizing Western philosophy as too much at a dead end to contribute helpfully to understanding our technological age, Heidegger insists that German thought, at least, cannot be salvaged by any takeover by Zen Buddhism or any other Eastern experiences of the world. Some answers to this puzzle have been attempted. Graham Parkes notes that Heidegger mentioned Taoism explicitly only twice during his 50 years of philosophical publication. When Parkes asked Hans-Georg Gadamer why that might be, Gadamer responded that a scholar of Heidegger's generation would have been reluctant to say anything in print about a philosophy whose texts he could not read in the original. This concern with original, untranslated texts is visible in a letter Heidegger wrote to organizers of a conference of Eastern and Western philosophers held in Hawaii. Quote, "The greatest difficulty in the enterprise of a dialogue between Eastern and Western thinking always lies, as far as I can see, in the fact that, with few exceptions, there is no command of the Eastern languages either in Europe or the United States. May your conference prove fruitful in spite of this circumstance." Unquote. Yet such translation concerns apparently did not prevent Heidegger from importing Taoism into his work, sub rosa, but rather only from acknowledging publicly that he was doing so. Thus, Taoist scholar J.J. Clark concludes, quote, "Heidegger's reflections on the globalizing telos of European language and thought, and remarks such as, 'We Europeans presumably inhabit a quite different house from East Asians,' must be set alongside comments concerning our inevitable dialogue with the East Asian world. But above all, they must be reconsidered in the light of the now inescapable fact that he drew inspiration for some of his major ideas from the East." Unquote. Heidegger's public silence with regard to the role of Taoism in his work may also merely be the result of recognizing that a true dialogue between East and West is not possible in a world still subject to what he described as the complete Europeanization of the earth and of man. Or it may be a feature of Heidegger's own attempt to practice Taoism. Heidegger admits in his fictitious dialogue, Conversation, in On the Way to Language, that there is a deeply hidden kinship between East Asian thought and his own attempts at thinking, but does not further explicate this. Chapter 41 of the Dao de Jing itself calls for reticence here, for according to it, the way must be left nameless.